you have $600,000 in super. You're 60. You've been told the whole thing is tax-free once you start drawing it down. That's true, but only for the money you actually spend. Here's the number nobody shows you. The minimum drawdown rule forces you to pull out 4% of your balance every single year. On $600,000, that's $24,000, whether you need it or not. And if your living costs are only $15,000 a year, that extra $9,000 doesn't stay tax-free. It sits in your bank account, earns interest, and that interest gets taxed at your marginal rate. The tax-free super promise has a leak in it. I've been close to this kind of situation a few times. I helped a client who had $700,000 in super and felt completely set for retirement. She'd done everything right, contributed consistently, kept fees low, diversified. But the minimum drawdown rule was quietly forcing money out of her tax-free environment every year, and it was piling up in a savings account, being taxed like ordinary income. She didn't know that was happening until we sat down and ran the numbers together. So, how do you keep that surplus working inside super without triggering a tax leak? And if you're also worried the age pension asset test is going to penalize you for having done a good job saving, we're going to look at a completely legal way to structure your assets so you can still qualify for up to around $47,000 a year for a couple. That's exactly what this video covers. If you're approaching retirement with a solid super balance and a paid-off home, and you feel like the rules are stacked against people who actually saved, hit subscribe now. We cut through the noise and show you the parts of the system that actually work in your favor. Let's talk about the two things that catch most people off guard when they reach retirement with a good-sized super balance. The first one is that minimum drawdown rule we just looked at. The ATO requires you to withdraw a percentage of your super balance every year once you start a pension account. 4% if you're between 60 and 64, rising as you get older. You can't leave it all sitting there. The money has to come out. So if your balance is $600,000 and you only need $18,000 to live on, the rule forces out $24,000. The extra $6,000 lands in your bank account, earns interest at, say, 4.5%, and that's $270 in taxable income sitting right there. Over 10 years, that's roughly $2,700 in tax you didn't need to pay, money that could have stayed inside a tax-free environment if you'd used the right structure. That's the first trap. The second one hits differently, and honestly, it catches more people by surprise. Meet Sarah and Michael. She's 62, he's 64. They own their home outright. They've got $650,000 in combined super and another $50,000 sitting in the bank. They've been careful savers their entire working lives. They're now looking at retirement and wondering how much age pension they'll qualify for. The answer, under the current rules, depends entirely on the asset test. For a couple who own their home, Services Australia starts tapering the age pension once your total assessable assets go above $481,500. Every $1,000 above that threshold cuts your pension by $3 per fortnight. That's $78 a year per $1,000 of assets. The maximum age pension for a couple, including the pension supplement and energy supplement, is $1,810.40 per fortnight, roughly $47,070 a year. That's the ceiling. And for every $1,000 of assets you hold above $481,500, that ceiling drops by $78 a year. Sarah and Michael's assessable assets total $700,000. That's $218,500 above the threshold. At $3 per fortnight per $1,000, the taper reduces their pension by $655.50 per fortnight. So instead of the maximum $1,810.40, they're looking at around $1,154.90 per fortnight, roughly $30,000 a year. Now, $30,000 a year is nothing to dismiss, but compare it to the $47,000 they could be receiving if their assessable assets were below $481,500. That's a $17,000 gap every single year indexed to inflation for as long as they live. Over 20 years, that gap is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost pension income. If you've spent 30 plus years doing the right thing, contributing to super, paying off your mortgage, building savings, and now the system is telling you that you've saved too much to get the maximum pension, that frustration is completely valid. The asset test doesn't reward savers. It tapers their entitlement based on a formula that was designed for the average case. And people who've been diligent get penalized for it on paper. But here's the thing worth understanding. The system isn't designed to punish you specifically. It's a blunt tool applied to millions of people, and it creates genuinely perverse outcomes for people in Sarah and Michael's position. The gap between just above the threshold and at the threshold is a very uncomfortable place to be, especially when the path from one to the other is shorter than most people think. What Sarah and Michael didn't know, and what most people in their position don't know, is that there are completely legal ways to reduce your assessable assets without actually losing control of your money. Not loopholes, not schemes, just using rules that already exist in the way they were designed to be used. So the system creates a tax leak on one side and a pension taper on the other. But the two-lever strategy we're going to walk through addresses both problems at the same time. And you don't need to be a financial expert to follow it. There are two levers in this strategy. They work independently, but together they solve both problems we just described. Lever 1 addresses the tax leak. When Sarah and Michael start their super pensions, each of them is required to draw down 4% of their balance every year. Combined, that forced withdrawal comes to roughly $26,000. But they've worked out they only need around $20,000 a year to live comfortably. That leaves a $6,000 surplus sitting outside super earning bank interest and generating taxable income every year. The move here is called a recontribution strategy. You take the full forced withdrawal, the $26,000, spend what you need, and then contribute the leftover $6,000 back into super as a non-concessional contribution. There's no tax on that contribution going back in. The money goes into an accumulation account inside super, keeps growing at the fund's earnings rate, and it stays in the tax-free environment it just came from. The non-concessional contribution cap is $120,000 a year for anyone under 75, so a $6,000 top-up is well within the limit. Over 10 years, that's around $2,700 in tax you never paid, and the $6,000 compounds inside super rather than sitting in a bank account generating taxable interest. It's a small move with a meaningful long-term difference. I used to assume that tax-free meant the entire super environment worked that way without exception. It took a client's confused tax return. She couldn't understand why she was getting a bill when her super was supposedly tax-free, for me to realize the gap was real and quiet, and most people didn't notice it until they were well into retirement. Lever 2 addresses the pension taper. Sarah and Michael's assessable assets are $700,000. Their pension entitlement under the current asset test works out to around $30,000 a year. But the maximum they could receive as a homeowner couple is about $47,070. That $17,000 gap represents money they're leaving on the table every single year, purely because their assets sit above the $481,500 full pension threshold. Services Australia has a gifting rule. You can give up to $10,000 per year to a family member, and that money is immediately removed from your assessable assets. Over any 5-year period, the total is capped at $30,000. Gifts have to be genuine. You can't informally expect the money back. But if you have adult children or family you'd like to support anyway, this is a structured way to do it while also reducing your asset test exposure. Sarah and Michael gift $10,000 this year, and $10,000 next year, and $10,000 the year after that. That's $30,000 removed from their assessable assets over 3 years. Their assessable assets drop from $700,000 to $670,000. At $670,000, the pension taper is $670,000 minus $481,500 equals $188,500 over threshold, which reduces the pension by $565.50 per fortnight. So their fortnightly pension rises from $1,154.90 to $1,244.90. An extra $90 per fortnight, or roughly $2,340 a year. That's not a dramatic shift, but it's permanent, it's indexed, and it grows larger if they continue gifting. I have a client I'll call Jane. She had kept her surplus pension money in a plain savings account for 3 years running. She was paying around $1,200 in extra tax every year, just because that money was sitting outside super earning interest. When she came to see me, we worked out the re-contribution structure, and within 12 months, the surplus was back inside super and growing in the right environment. It wasn't complicated. It just required knowing the rule existed. So here's how the two paths compare. If Sarah and Michael ignore both levers, they stay at $700,000 in assessable assets. Their pension stays at around $30,000 a year, and the surplus keeps generating taxable interest. If they use both levers, recontributing the surplus and gifting strategically, they steadily reduce the taper, increase their pension entitlement year by year, and stop the tax leak at the same time. That's not two separate strategies. That's one framework with two switches. If this is making sense and you've been feeling the pinch of the asset test, type "solved" in the comments. I want to know how many of you have been caught by this exact trap. Before you commit to any retirement structure, it's worth asking, what happens when things go wrong? Not if, when. Markets drop. Health events happen. Let's run the two-lever strategy through two real scenarios and see whether it holds up. Scenario 1. A 20% market drawdown, the kind we saw in 2020. Sarah and Michael's $650,000 super balance drops to $520,000. Their total assessable assets, super plus bank account, fall from $700,000 to around $570,000. Their minimum drawdown is now 4% of $520,000, which is $20,800. And here's something counterintuitive. The market crash actually improves their pension position. At $570,000 in assessable assets, the taper from the $481,500 threshold is much smaller. Their pension entitlement increases from around $30,000 a year to roughly $40,000 a year because the same formula that punishes higher balances starts working in their favor when balances fall. But the traditional approach has a hidden problem here. If you haven't been managing your surplus, if it's been piling up in a bank account because you didn't know about recontribution, then you've been paying tax on that interest income during the years your balance was at its peak, and you've lost the compounding benefit of keeping it inside super. The crash reveals the cost of not having a strategy in place during the good years. With the two-lever approach, that surplus was going back into super year by year. The market drop still hits, but the amount of unprotected taxable interest income is much smaller. And because the gifting strategy was already in motion, their assessable assets were already trending down before the crash accelerated the movement. Scenario 2. An unexpected medical bill of $25,000. For Australians over 65, routine out-of-pocket medical costs run between $2,000 and $5,000 a year, according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. But a major event, something like a hip replacement or a cardiac procedure, can easily generate $20,000 to $25,000 in gap payments, even with private health cover. That's a real shock to a retirement cash flow. With the traditional approach, Sarah and Michael have to pull extra money out of super to cover it. Lump sums from super after age 60 are generally tax-free, so there's no immediate tax cost. But every dollar pulled out early is a dollar that's no longer compounding inside a tax-free environment. The long-term cost is invisible, which makes it easy to ignore until it compounds over many years. With the two-lever approach, they've been keeping their annual surplus, the $6,000 they recontributed back into super, in a dedicated buffer between the pension payout and the contribution. Over 3 or 4 years, that buffer provides a working reserve for exactly this kind of event, without needing to change the superstructure at all. A strategy builds in the buffer before the event occurs. A default leaves you improvising when it does. So the two-lever approach holds up through a crash and a health crisis. But most people I speak with understand all of this logically and still don't move. The reason has nothing to do with the numbers. It has everything to do with how the brain handles change. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Most people who hear the two-lever strategy understand it. They nod, they say it makes sense. And then they don't do anything. That's not a knowledge problem. That's a psychology problem. For 30 years, the advice has been the same: max your super contributions, leave it alone, and let it compound. That is genuinely good advice during the accumulation phase. But when you cross into retirement, the rules change. The optimal behavior changes. And your brain, which has spent decades associating touching super with making a mistake, now treats the right move like a threat. There's a name for this. Psychologists call it loss aversion, the tendency to feel the pain of a loss more intensely than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. When you think about redirecting money out of your pension and recontributing the surplus, your brain registers, I'm losing tax-free status, even though you're actually moving that money back into a tax-free account within days. The sequence feels risky because it involves a withdrawal. The withdrawal feels like loss. There's also the status quo bias, the tendency to stay with whatever you're currently doing simply because changing feels uncertain. You know what you have. You don't fully know what you'll get. Even if the math clearly favors changing, the known discomfort of today feels safer than the unknown benefit of tomorrow. I'm not judging anyone for this. These aren't character flaws. They're how human brains process uncertainty, especially around money, and especially around something as significant as a retirement nest egg. But here's a reframe that I've found genuinely useful. Instead of thinking, I'm moving money out of my tax-free super into a taxable bank account, think of it this way. You are briefly parking money in a transit account while you redirect it to a better destination. The transit phase is measured in days. The destination is still inside super, still tax-free, still compounding. You're not losing the advantage. You're routing around an inefficiency in the system. And for the gifting strategy, yes, you're giving money away. But it's money you were probably going to leave to your children anyway, delivered earlier and structured in a way that earns you $41,600 a year in age pension in return. That's not a gift. That's one of the best returns on capital in the whole retirement system. I'll say this. I've made mistakes too. I once missed a gifting deadline by 1 day for a client one day, and it cost them $2,000 in lost pension entitlement for that year. I felt terrible about it. I also learned to put calendar reminders in well in advance and to treat the deadline as a hard date rather than an approximate one. The strategy is sound. The execution just needs to be precise. Let's make this practical. Here are 3 steps you can take in order starting this financial year. Step 1. Run the numbers on your minimum drawdown. Work out what your super fund is required to pay you this year. 4% of your balance if you're between 60 and 64. Then work out what you actually need to cover your living costs. The gap between those two numbers is your surplus. If there's any surplus at all, you can recontribute that amount back into super as a non-concessional contribution. No tax on the way back in, no special process, just a contribution form with your fund. The non-concessional cap is $120,000 a year for anyone under 75, so unless you're pulling out very large sums, you have plenty of room. Even a $6,000 surplus recontributed saves you around $270 a year in tax. Not dramatic on its own, but compounded over a decade inside super, it adds up to far more than $270. Step 2. Review your gifting position. If your assessable assets are above the $481,500 threshold, meaning the age pension taper has already started reducing your entitlement, look at whether gifting makes sense for your situation. The rule is up to $10,000 per year, with a total cap of $30,000 over any rolling 5-year period. Gifts have to be genuine. No expecting the money back, no informal arrangements. Each $10,000 you gift reduces your assessable assets by $10,000, which translates to an extra $78 a year in pension for a couple. Over 5 years, a $30,000 gifting program adds roughly $2,340 a year to your pension entitlement, permanently, because the age pension is indexed and doesn't stop. Step 3. If your assets are still well above the threshold after steps 1 and 2, get professional advice on trust structures. A discretionary trust can hold investments in a way that Centrelink treats differently to directly owned assets, particularly if the trust has multiple beneficiaries. This one has more moving parts and requires an advisor who understands age pension rules specifically, not just a general wealth manager. The strategy is legal and well established, but the setup needs to be done correctly. To make this real, I worked with a couple who had $720,000 in assessable assets. At that level, their asset test taper was reducing their pension by around $715 per fortnight compared to the maximum. After 3 years of gifting $10,000 a year, their assessable assets came down to $690,000, their fortnightly pension increased by roughly $90, and they added about $2,340 a year to their pension income, permanently for the rest of their lives. It sounds modest, but that's $46,800 over 20 years in today's dollars, from following a checklist and setting a calendar reminder each year. Drop a comment with the first step you're going to take. I'll reply with a specific tip based on your situation. Let's bring it back to the 2 things that actually matter here. The tax-free super promise is real, but it has a gap in it. The minimum drawdown rule forces money out of your tax-free environment every year. And if you don't manage that surplus deliberately, it sits in a bank account being taxed like ordinary income for the rest of your retirement. The recontribution strategy closes that gap. It's not complicated. It just needs to be done each year. The age pension asset test isn't going away. If your assessable assets are above $481,500 as a homeowner couple, you're already in the taper zone, which means every $1,000 you can legitimately reduce is worth $78 a year in extra pension, permanently. The gifting strategy is a structured, legal way to work within that system, not against it. Over 5 years, it's worth thousands. Over 20 years, it's worth far more. You don't need both levers running at full speed from day one. Pick the one that applies to your situation first, understand it fully, then add the second. Even one step this week, running the drawdown numbers, checking your asset test position, or having a conversation about gifting with your family, moves you in the right direction. If you're a saver who has worked hard and doesn't want to be quietly penalized for it, this channel is for you. Hit subscribe, and we'll keep showing you the parts of the retirement system that actually work in your favor. You've already done the hard part. You saved. Now let's make sure the system works for you.